Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The Julian Assange case has finally broken into the mainstream.
Not before time, as he's currently in bulletproof glass box in Woolwich Crown Fort, in a hearing that will decide whether he lives or dies behind bars.
The publisher of WikiLeaks has been wanted all along by successive US administrations, and according to Assange's counsel, Edward Fitzgerald QC, the US had not just filmed every aspect of Julian's life in the Sovereign Embassy of Ecuador in London, but had actively considered his death.
There are signs of increasing anxieties about the Assange case, stretching from Amnesty International through the New York Times to the leader of Her Majesty's opposition in the British Parliament.
A steady stream of prominent American writers has been heading to the unlikely London destination of Belmarsh, one of the more distinguished of whom is Joe Lauria, editor-in-chief of Consortium News, formerly of the Wall Street Journal and the Boston Globe, all the way from Virginia. And joining us now, Joe, you are a big name in American journalists' circles. There you were on the Belmarsh. It's not the most salubrious part of London. How did you find it? What's your impression of the English justice system so far?
So far, not very good, George, I have to tell you. Certainly it's a desolate location, no doubt about that. But going into that courtroom, sitting in the public gallery, and watching Julian behind that bulletproof glass, you have to wonder what exactly they're thinking by treating him this way, by strip-searching him, handcuffing him 11 times the day before the trial began. This is a kind of hubris that they've got. I mean, the government case is so weak, as if they feel like they have it in the bag, George. They don't really have to put forward an argument. And treating him this way just to show that they can, humiliating him like this, is so gratuitous. You have to really consider this being not justice at all.
Well, it is a paradox, though, because if, as you say, and I couldn't possibly comment in this chair, that they think they've got it in the bag and it's a show trial, in other words, why compound that by these extraordinary characteristics of the case? Should be in Westminster. Instead, it's in what Gayatri called Woolwich Crown Fort, a fortress attached to Belmarsh Jail, a terrorism court, really.
Yep.
Why a bulletproof box? Why strip searching and handcuffing and so on? It seems odd to me, as a legislator for nearly 30 years, that the British authorities would compound the unpopularity internationally of this case by treating Assange in this way.
Yeah, there could be a backlash, but I think they see him as an extremely dangerous person, not violently, but dangerous to their survival in this power that they have. Why?
The pen being mightier than the sword.
Absolutely. We have got total omissions of the coverage of this story. There's not being covered back in the U.S. by the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of the big media. You hardly see it here in Britain, except the tabloids highlighting some awful thing about Assange, as they've been doing all along as part of the disinformation campaign that began in 2008 by the Pentagon, and we now know. Britain and the U.S. in particular, are we democracies that can tolerate dissent to the point of revealing government misconduct and wrongdoing and crimes? Or are we growing into a totalitarian society that will crush that dissent and make an example of this man? It really is the Dreyfus case. This is the Dreyfus case of our age, and that they're not covering it is just part of this omitting and covering and sweeping under the carpet the crimes, and now the man who exposed the crimes. They don't want the American people to know about this. The impeachment hearings in the U.S. of Trump, he committed at least 4 war crimes that I could tell, and that he's not tried for that. Why? Because it's a bipartisan cover-up. Not have the American people even hear about these atrocities that Trump and previous presidents have committed, and they want future presidents to be able to do it as well. So they got him on some flimsy charge. Assange is the most dangerous man in the world to ruling circles in the U.S. and Britain, and that's why he's being treated the way he is.
Extraordinary. Now, you and I are at d'un certain age. We remember when journalism was something.
I remember journalism.
A journalist was something to be. People grew up watching Woodward and Bernstein. They thrilled to the Pentagon Papers disclosures in the New York Times. They saw the revelations, Hersh's revelations about My Lai. Here in Britain, the Sunday Times broke the story on the thalidomide scandal and so on. How did journalism go from that to this?
Well, I could tell you, there are fewer jobs in journalism, fewer owners. So there's been a consolidation of the media, and we've got a vanity that's taken over this profession to try to emulate or to live vicariously through people with power, rather than realizing we have a stronger power to hold those people with power to account. We also see a huge change. Look at the Ellsberg case. He was, of course, on trial for stealing the Pentagon Papers, and the New York Times and the Washington Post went and fought and won at the Supreme Court for that. Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office was bugged. They tried to bribe the judge in that case by offering him the FBI directorship. When this became known, the case was thrown out. Here's Julian Assange. He was spied on by the prosecuting government in the defense preparations between him and his lawyers. Privileged conversations were spied on by the Spanish company that was given directly to the CIA or sold to them. This would be thrown out immediately. If it were still the age of Ellsberg, it would be thrown out. But we're in a much worse position than we are now, even than back then during the Vietnam War.
The proprietors are one thing. What about the practitioners?
Yeah.
We mustn't elide that point, I think. People wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein and Hersh and Joe Lauria. They wanted to be exposing things, bringing truths out from under rocks. I get the sense they're not any longer wanting to be that.
No, some of them might be, but most of them, I think, are caught up in the fame and the money or whatever they think they can get out of this. Just playing the part of a reporter rather than actually doing that job. And it's a crisis in journalism. And they are very much not challenging government, especially intelligence agencies. We had the Operation Phoenix during the 50s where the CIA were paying journalists in the U.S. and in other countries. But now they don't even have to pay them anymore. They seem to be suck up to power and feel that they need to just automatically report whatever is whispered in their ear by some intelligence source without challenging that. There is such a lack of standards that have fallen here, and it's wanting to prop up power in a way that was the exact opposite of what you're describing, George, in those days in the 70s when we wanted to be able to uncover, which is what Julian Assange has done, and that's why they vilify him as well. He's doing the job they should be doing.
Yeah, that's the only explanation, really, for the silence. Because as I said at the meeting we both addressed earlier this week, the place should have been full of journalists, because if they really wanted to be journalists, this Assange case is a major threat to them.
Yes, it absolutely is. I want to ask you a question, George, if I may.
Of course.
On the way over here, I heard of some minister or MP talking about our sovereignty here in Britain against the EU and this trade deal. What about the sovereignty of the United Kingdom towards the United States? Isn't it a time that this country grows a backbone and stands up to the U.S., particularly when the U.S. is refusing to extradite back here this woman, Sakalos, of course, who killed that young boy? And here they expect the United Kingdom to send Assange back. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm sorry, that's humiliating for Britain, isn't it? What's going on?
It is, I should say, from this chair, patchy. The British government did stand up to the US over the Huawei affair. And they're not on side with the tearing up of the Iran nuclear deal. So there are one or two little islands of independent thought and action, but this goes way back further than the lifetime of this administration. I was a member of Parliament when this extradition treaty was signed. In parenthesis, we're now told that the treaty itself is actually not that important. What it says in it, it's just a text, just a bit of paper. But it was evident then, and this was under Tony Blair's government, that this must be the most one-sided extradition treaty ever signed by a free country with another in all history. And when I raised this with its author, the then Home Secretary David Blunkett, he said, don't worry, 4.1 precludes any political cases being extradited to the United States. And though that's on the face of the treaty, we're told it's now inoperable. So yeah, taking back control from the EU is one thing, but only to hand it to Washington, that would be an odd way of taking back control, wouldn't it?
It would indeed. I think, unfortunately, I think the intelligence services here in Britain also want to get Assange, so there must be some kind of pressure on the government. I mean, Corbyn was pretty clever in raising first the Sakalos case and then saying, well, by the way, what about Julian Assange? And he did get the Prime Minister to admit that it's an unequal treaty and should be looked at, and that, of course, we should protect whistleblowers and journalists, but you have to wonder whether that was, he sees that voters are angry about this extradition that's not happening from the U.S. I don't know what kind of pressure we put on this court. I don't know if it's ultimately the decision of Vanessa Barreza, but we're having, of course, in May, the rest of this process, and let's hope that it becomes something serious. The government has laid out a very poor case, and Assange's people have absolutely demolished him, particularly on the story about the password, that he was not trying, Assange was not trying to help Chelsea Manning break into a government database, which Chelsea Manning already had legal access to, as the indictment says, but to help her download music videos and movies and games, video games, because they're forbidden in the military. I mean, that blew me away when I heard that. That just destroys the first indictment. Now we're dealing with the superseding indictment, which is only about this Section E of this Espionage Act, which does prohibit the unauthorized possession and dissemination of classified information, which journalists have been doing for decades. This is the first one who's been charged under that. And that is what's so dangerous about that in terms of going forward with the consequences for journalism. If another journalist steps out of line, then he could also face dangers. This is why this trial is so damned important, and to be ignored and to be buried and to continue to smear Assange and to treat him this way is just very chilling for I think, for our democracy.
Of course, Consortium News has covered the case extensively. In Britain, it has not been until this week. But on the ground, the people are with Julian. Of course, in declining numbers, unfortunately, because the case has been going on for so long. You've just come from Australia, where he's from, where he's a citizen.
That's right.
And you are from the US. How is it on the ground there?
Yeah, is it picking up in Australia?
It is. There's a parliamentary group. Andrew Wilkie was here with George Christensen, and that.
It's a bit late, though, isn't it?
It's late, but you know, this is the way the news cycle goes. Now, there was a major radio personality in Australia who last night has millions of followers on the air who said that's it. I'm calling Maurice Payne, the foreign minister, and saying we got to get Assange back. So, I mean, that kind of pressure has apparently some. But what can the Australian government do? I think it's too late, as you said, to intervene at this part. Will they listen to the Australian government when the U.S. government wants him so badly? And as I think here, MI6 wants him as well.
Joe, it's been an honor to have you here. Best of luck on the rest of your travels.
Yes.
Take care with that coronavirus, some of the places you're headed to.
Okay.
Coming up next, one of the world's great authorities on Latin America. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Sputnik. I spent some of the times of my life standing with the Sandinistas, the Nicaraguan revolutionary movement, which overthrew one of the worst Latin American dictators, Somoza, way back in 1979. I became a personal friend of many of the leaders of that revolution. Since they were driven out of power by the US-backed Contras, my own focus has had to be elsewhere. I didn't miss their re-election, of course, and hoped for the best. But it seems the regime change machine in Washington is back and hard at work.
Our next guest never lost focus and is a supreme authority, not just on Nicaragua or even Venezuela, about which he's just published his latest book, but on Latin America as a whole and its tortured relations with its giant to its north.
Professor Dan Kovalik teaches at Pittsburgh School of Law, is a labour and human rights lawyer and an author. And I'm glad to say he joins us now. It's a rare honour. You're American royalty for us. You're on a big speaking tour, not just in Britain, but in Ireland. So we're glad you were able to come in. A lot of people, I suspect, like me, were heavily involved in Nicaragua solidarity in the 80s. But after the revolution fell, as it were, had to turn their attentions elsewhere and haven't really refocused. Tell us why people should.
Yes, well, as you know, in 1990, the Sandinistas stood for election. They were defeated, really under the threat of continued war by the United States that was supporting the Contras. And the people essentially capitulated and said, okay, we want the war to end. Sandinistas were voted out of power, and they stepped down. What began was 17 years of neoliberal policies in Nicaragua, which were devastating to the poor and working people. And finally, in 2006, the Sandinistas were reelected, which was a major blow to U.S. policy in Central America. And what they have done since that time is not given enough credit. Let me just throw out one statistic. The UN ranks Nicaragua now 5th in the world for gender equality.
Wow.
That's an amazing feat for a Central American country. Since the Sandinistas were reelected and took office in 2007, the economy has grown by almost 5% every year. Poverty has been reduced by around 40%. And now Nicaragua is nearly 100% food sovereign, meaning that they grow nearly all the food that they eat, and they're now beginning to export food, including to Venezuela.
Now, Venezuela, about which it's your book that's currently on sale.
Yes.
I'm going to talk about the book that's coming out in April also. You're a very prolific and brilliant writer, I must say. Venezuela, is that going to be visited on Nicaragua? Are they headed into the... Because what you've got now is more or less total war, short of actually firing missiles between the US and Venezuela. Is that the direction that Nicaragua is now headed?
I fear that that is the case. In fact, in late 2018, the U.S. Congress passed and Donald Trump signed into law what is called the NICA Act, which is a very punishing sanctions regime against Nicaragua, which cuts them off from almost all international financing. For example, from the IMF and the World Bank, financing the Sandinistas were using to reduce poverty, to build housing, to engage in other social programs. This is the same thing they're doing to Venezuela. And we know that they have been funding violent groups inside Nicaragua. In fact, funding reconstituted Contra groups in Nicaragua to try to challenge the Sandinistas, who will be up for election again in 2021.
How is Nicaragua's relations with its surrounding countries, the rest of Latin America?
Well, they've been good in many ways, but because of the U.S. isolation, a lot of countries have then followed suit and isolated them as well. But what is undeniable is how stable Nicaragua is. In fact, the interesting thing is that while Trump talks about his concern for the migration from Central America to the United States, Nicaragua is not a Central American country that's producing many migrants to the United States because it is so stable.
Well, this is one of the factors. Obviously, there's lots of Venezuelan diaspora in the U.S., but less so from Nicaragua.
That's right. That's right. And certainly, there's very few that are trying to come in up Central America into the U.S. through the Mexican border, again, because of what the Sandinistas have done. And now, of course, the U.S. is risking that by trying to wreck their economy, as they have wrecked Venezuela's economy.
Their policy is going to produce refugees heading north. Now, if you're American royalty, and you are, Stone, Oliver Stone is... what's higher than royalty? I mean, he's up there. And
He's like the Queen Mother, I guess. I don't.
Now, he did a foreword to your Venezuela book, and I see he's got a blurb on the front of your latest book coming out in April, No More War. He's an important cultural icon. How much is he getting involved in these issues?
Well, Oliver Stone is unique, meaning one of a kind in the U.S. He is a successful Hollywood director, producer. He's won, I believe, 2 Academy Awards, maybe 3, including for his movie Platoon. And yet, unlike many of the Hollywood elite, he has remained true to his values. He is active in promoting the revolutions in Latin America. He has a documentary movie that's a couple years old called South of the Border, in which he interviews Hugo Chavez. He interviews Evo Morales. He is very active in defending Latin America, in defending Cuba from the attacks by the United States. And he had the courage, really, to go to Russia and interview Vladimir Putin during a time when Putin is being vilified as this, new Hitler, if you will. I
don't know about Hitler. He's certainly being imbued with supernatural powers to influence other people's elections.
Right.
I mean, it turns out that in Pittsburgh, they're just waiting for the latest word from Putin to decide which of the 2 Russian assets, Sanders or Trump, they should plump for. Just for reasons of time, let me turn to this point. There have been many setbacks for people with your perspective on Latin America. Morales, you talked about, is now in exile, I think in Argentina.
Yes.
The Venezuelans are under siege. The Nicaraguans soon to be under total siege, certainly under the early stages of a siege at the moment. There was a moment, we're old enough to remember when it was, I mean, we've seen all this musical chairs before, but we are certainly old enough to remember when Latin American social change was the hope of the world, and it's all being rolled back or in danger of being rolled back. How pessimistic are you about the coming years?
I'm not pessimistic, George. I'm optimistic. First of all, as a revolutionary, and I'm a revolutionary, I think you have to be optimistic, But also you see that despite the setbacks, and there have been some major setbacks in Latin America, there have been some gains. The new elections in Argentina, for example, which got rid of a neoliberal government. You see the massive protests in Chile, which are challenging the neoliberal government there.
And the victory in Mexico for your
victory
friends?
In Mexico with AMLO. And frankly, Venezuela's victory in this last year, surviving this attempted coup, U.S.-backed coup of Juan Guaido.
Now, you're speaking in Liverpool, in Edinburgh, in Belfast.
That's right.
How can people check the venues and dates and so on and come and see you?
Yes, if you check me out on Facebook at Dan Kovalik, or you check me out on Twitter at Daniel M. Kovalik, you'll see me updating and putting out information about those venues.
I hope you fill the halls, because there's nobody better in the, I was going to say the West, but I suppose I mean the North,
yes.
at describing what's happening. As I say, it's a real privilege to have had you here
and for
on
me,
the Sputnik.
for me.
Kovalik.
Thank
Thanks
you
for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So, Julian Assange, we asked whether British justice will prevail in his case. And Martin Meacham says, no, it won't. They may as well tear down the statue of blind justice and break it into little pieces and use it to repair roads with. And Stephen Amott says, British justice, what a joke. Not a single barrister or judge has stood up to complain about the dreadful treatment Assange has received. Convicted criminals have higher moral values.
Well, actually, that's not true. For example, Assange's counsel asked for him to be allowed to sit with his lawyers and the prosecution counsel supported that. The judge, so far, has refused it, though that might change. All I'll say to you is this. I'd rather take my chances in front of a British judge than a British politician or a British newspaper editor or a British member of parliament. I may be the last man standing.
I think you are the last man standing. Nobody has responded
Well,
positively
I
to
may
our
be
question.
the last man standing, wouldn't be the first time, who says that at one level, maybe not in this court, but in subsequent appeals, at one level, justice for Julian will prevail.
Well, anyway, this is all the time we've got for the tweets today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But of course, you can stay in touch with us on our social media, on Twitter and Instagram. It's RT_Sputnik, on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.